Egypt is not just a country of ruins. It is a burial ground of dynasties, of broken temples, of missing scrolls, of kings who claimed eternity, then vanished under sand. And somewhere inside that immense silence, a rumor turns red. The Red Grail. Not a proven chalice, not an artifact waiting neatly in a museum drawer. Something stranger, a trail of symbols, where blood, kingship, sacred vessels, resurrection, and desert secrecy begin to twist together until history and longing become difficult to separate. So we begin carefully, not with certainty, but with a question buried deep enough to survive. To follow this rumor, we have to move slowly. Egypt rewards patience, not impatience. Its mysteries rarely arrive as thunder. More often, they appear as fragments, a name carved into stone, a text found in the sand, a dynasty pretending its blood was divine. And this is where the story becomes dangerous in a quieter way. Because the moment a symbol becomes powerful enough, people begin to treat it like evidence. Tonight, we enter an Egypt made of tombs, libraries, ports, temples, royal marriages, sacred myths, and missing records. We will not pretend the Red Grail has been found. We will ask why such a story could attach itself to Egypt at all. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because beneath the sand, not every secret is an object. Some are ideas, and ideas can bleed through centuries. Chapter 2. Before the Grail was red. Before the Grail could become red, it had to become holy. And that is already a clue. The object most people imagine when they hear the word Grail does not begin in Egypt. It does not rise from a pharaoh's tomb, or from a temple beside the Nile, or from some sealed chamber beneath Alexandria. It belongs first to the world of medieval romance. Castles, wounded kings, wandering knights, strange processions, and stories told in courts far removed from the desert. The Grail's earliest literary shape appears in the medieval Arthurian tradition, where it was not yet the fully formed Christian relic that later centuries would recognize. In some of the earliest versions, it is mysterious, radiant, and important, but not always clearly explained. It may be a serving vessel. It may be a sacred object. It may be something the hero fails to understand at the crucial moment. That ambiguity is part of its original power. The Grail did not begin as a solved symbol. It began as a question moving through a story. Only later did writers give it the meaning that became familiar. The cup of the Last Supper, the vessel associated with Christ's blood, the relic carried into legend by Joseph of Arimathea. That Christian interpretation became so influential that many people now assume it was always there from the beginning. But legends rarely arrive fully dressed. They gather clothing as they travel. This matters because the moment we move the Grail backward into ancient Egypt, we are not following the oldest evidence. We are following a later imagination. That does not make the imagination worthless, but it does change what kind of story we are telling. A medieval chalice can be powerful. A Christian relic can become a magnet for devotion. A symbol of blood and salvation can echo across cultures. But none of that proves that the Holy Grail was an Egyptian object, or that Egyptian priests guarded a secret chalice, or that pharaohs possessed the original version of a relic later hidden inside Arthurian legend. That leap is where mystery begins to harden into misinformation. It is easy to see why the leap is tempting. Egypt feels older than almost everything. When a story seems too vast for medieval Europe, people often search for a deeper root. And Egypt is waiting there like a grand archive with half its shelves missing. The pyramids are older than the Roman Empire by millennia. The temples outlasted languages. The dead were prepared for eternity with an attention that still unnerves us. If one wants to make a legend feel ancient, Egypt offers the perfect stage. But a perfect stage is not the same as proof. The historical Grail tradition belongs to texts, not excavated Egyptian relics. It is preserved in poems, romances, theological retellings, and later literary cycles. Its world is not Memphis or Thebes. It is the symbolic landscape of medieval Christendom, where knighthood, sin, purity, kingship, and salvation were woven into adventure. The Grail becomes important because it sits at the intersection of spiritual hunger and aristocratic storytelling. A knight does not simply find an object. He is tested by it. That is one reason the Grail became so durable. It was never just a cup. It was a measure of the person searching for it. And that is where the Egyptian rumor finds a narrow doorway. Because Egypt had its own older language for sacred power. It had vessels, rituals, divine kingship, death, rebirth, hidden names, and bloodlines of rule. It had myths in which restoration mattered more than ordinary survival. It had gods who were dismembered and made whole, kings who became more than human after death, and sacred objects whose meaning depended on ritual context rather than simple ownership. So when later writers and modern theorists try to connect Egypt to the Grail, they are usually not finding a direct historical chain. They are noticing symbolic similarities and then treating resemblance as inheritance. That is a very human mistake. Two traditions can share imagery without sharing an origin. A cup can be sacred in more than one culture. Blood can signify life, kinship, sacrifice, or divinity in many places. A ruler can claim sacred legitimacy without belonging to a secret bloodline. A buried text can change what we know about religion without confirming every rumor attached to it. The problem is not symbolism. The problem is forcing symbols to behave like documents. A symbol invites interpretation. A document asks to be read in context. An artifact must be dated, located, compared, tested, and understood alongside everything around it. When those boundaries collapse, the past becomes strangely easy to manipulate. A medieval romance becomes an encoded memory of ancient Egypt. A Christian relic becomes a dynastic secret. A metaphor becomes a map. And suddenly, the Red Grail seems to have been waiting beneath the sand all along. But when we slow down, the trail looks different. The Grail, as a named tradition, emerges from medieval European literature. Its Christian meaning develops through later retellings. Its association with blood becomes central because of Christian theology, especially the blood of Christ, sacrifice, redemption, and the Eucharistic imagination of the Middle Ages. This is not Egyptian religion in disguise. It is a medieval spiritual drama using the language and anxieties of its own world. That distinction does not drain the story of mystery. It actually makes the mystery more interesting, because the question changes. Instead of asking, "Did ancient Egypt have the Holy Grail?" we can ask, "Why do later cultures keep sending their holiest mysteries back to Egypt?" That question is harder to answer and much more revealing. Egypt has long functioned as a kind of mirror. Different ages look into it, and see what they desire. Wisdom, danger, magic, forbidden knowledge, lost science, divine kingship, the origin of religion, the origin of civilization, sometimes even the origin of themselves. Medieval writers did not need Egypt to create the Grail, but later readers, especially modern ones, often needed Egypt to make the Grail feel deeper, darker, and older than the texts themselves allowed. That is how legends expand. They do not merely preserve memory, they attract need. A relic tied to Christ's blood becomes, in later speculation, a sign of hidden lineage. A vessel becomes a womb. A holy cup becomes a coded body. A story about spiritual worth becomes a story about ancestry. And when Egypt enters that chain of reinterpretation, the desert gives the whole idea an atmosphere of buried authority. Yet atmosphere can be dangerous. It can make an unsupported claim feel ancient simply because it sounds ancient. So before we follow the red thread into pharaohs, queens, Alexandria, and desert manuscripts, we have to leave one marker firmly in the ground. The Holy Grail is not documented as an ancient Egyptian artifact. Its historical home is medieval legend, later shaped by Christian meaning, and then reshaped again by centuries of interpretation. What Egypt offers is not the Grail before the Grail. It offers an older vocabulary of sacred rule, divine blood, ritual vessels, death, rebirth, and secrecy. Those ideas do not prove the legend came from Egypt, but they help explain why Egypt became such fertile ground for people trying to imagine that it did. And sometimes, the most important thing a historian can do is not chase the most exciting version of a story. It is to ask where the story learned to look exciting. Chapter 3. Egypt's older idea of sacred blood. Long before medieval poets imagined a shining vessel in the halls of Arthurian kings, Egypt had already built one of the ancient world's most enduring languages of sacred power. It was not the language of the Grail. It was older, stranger, and more public. In Egypt, kingship was not merely government with better jewelry. The pharaoh was not presented as a normal ruler who happened to sit on a throne. He stood at the meeting point between the human world and the divine order. His body mattered. His lineage mattered. His rituals mattered. His image, carved again and again into temple walls, mattered because it told the country what reality was supposed to look like. The king smiting enemies. The king offering to the gods. The king crowned by divine hands. The king receiving life, stability, and dominion. These were not casual decorations. They were political theology in stone. To modernize, it can be tempting to reduce this to propaganda. And of course, it was propaganda. Ancient states were not shy about making power look inevitable. But Egyptian kingship was not propaganda in the shallow sense. It was not simply a ruler saying, "Obey me because I am strong." And it was a ruler being placed inside a cosmic system where order itself depended on his role. The Egyptians called that order ma'at, balance, truth, justice, rightness, the world held in its proper shape. The pharaoh was expected to uphold it. Floods, harvests, temples, borders, offerings, law, the favor of the gods. All of these could be imagined as part of a single sacred structure. When the king ruled properly, the world remained aligned. When disorder threatened, it was not only political trouble, it was cosmic danger. This is where blood enters the story, but not in the way modern conspiracy tales often want it to. Sacred blood in Egypt was not a hidden code for a secret European lineage. It was not a whispered clue leading toward a medieval chalice. It was part of a much older idea, that royal succession carried religious meaning. The king's body was a vessel of office. His descent helped legitimize his right to rule. His relationship to the gods was staged through birth stories, coronation scenes, temple ritual, and funerary transformation. A pharaoh could be associated with Horus in life and with Osiris in death. That simple sentence carries an entire universe of meaning. Horus, the living kingship, the divine son who claims the throne. Osiris, the dead king, restored beyond death, ruler of the afterlife. The transition from one king to another could therefore be imagined as more than a transfer of administration. It was a sacred continuity. A dead ruler entered a divine pattern. A living ruler took up the role of cosmic mediator. This does not mean every succession was smooth. Egypt's history is full of rivalry, instability, foreign rule, short reigns, erased names, and awkward repairs to official memory. The sacred image of kingship was often more stable than the politics beneath it. That tension is important. It reminds us that divine kingship was not proof that everyone believed every royal claim equally. It was the language through which power had to justify itself. A weak ruler still needed sacred imagery. A disputed heir still needed ritual legitimacy. A new dynasty still needed to look ancient. That is one of Egypt's great political arts, the ability to make change appear as restoration. A ruler might come from outside the old royal line, or even from outside Egypt itself, and still present himself as the guardian of timeless order. Temples could be expanded. Offerings could be made. Old titles could be adopted. The visual grammar remained familiar, even when the people holding power changed. It was not enough to conquer Egypt. One had to be translated into Egypt. This is why later cultures found Egyptian kingship so magnetic. It offered a model of power that seemed to run deeper than law or army or wealth. It claimed that rule could be written into the structure of the universe. A crown was not merely a crown. A throne was not merely a chair. A bloodline was not merely genealogy. It could be treated as the visible edge of an invisible order. But we need to be careful with that phrase. Bloodline. Modern ears hear it and often jump at once to secrecy, forbidden descent, hidden heirs, suppressed documents. Ancient Egypt was not innocent of dynastic politics. But its sacred kingship was not built around the same kind of hidden bloodline fantasy that appears in modern Grail conspiracies. Egyptian royal legitimacy was usually performed openly. It was carved, painted, sung, titled, repeated, paraded, and placed before the gods. The point was not to hide the sacred claim. The point was to make it impossible to ignore. That is a crucial difference. A secret bloodline survives by concealment. A divine kingship survives by display. The pharaoh's sacred status had to be seen. His rituals had to be enacted. His names had to be written. His image had to be multiplied across the land until even stone seemed to agree with him. In this world, power became persuasive through repetition. Every temple relief was a kind of argument. The gods recognized this king, therefore Egypt should recognize him too. And yet, beneath that public certainty, there was always something fragile. A king could die without a clear heir. A dynasty could collapse. A foreign power could take the throne. Priests could become influential. Queens could rule directly or indirectly. Memories could be edited. Names could be removed. Tombs could be robbed. The monuments promised eternity, but history kept interrupting. That interruption is where later imagination finds room to enter. When we look back across thousands of years, we do not see a complete record. We see survival shaped by accident. Stone lasts. Papyrus often does not. Official claims survive better than private doubts. Victorious kings tell louder stories than defeated ones. And in those gaps, modern minds begin to wonder what was hidden. Sometimes that wondering is useful. It asks better questions. It notices what official records tried to smooth over. It refuses to treat royal imagery as neutral fact. But sometimes the wondering becomes hungry. It wants every missing document to conceal a revelation. It wants every broken line of succession to become a secret. It wants every sacred symbol to be a clue in a puzzle designed for us. That is when Egypt becomes less a civilization and more a screen for projection. The older Egyptian idea of sacred blood was not about a single relic waiting to be discovered. It was about the body of the king as a religious and political instrument. It was about descent, ritual, and divine recognition. It was about making authority feel older than the person who held it. And this helps explain why the Red Grail rumor attaches itself so easily to Egyptian soil. A Grail story is drawn toward blood because blood can mean sacrifice, inheritance, life, death, and legitimacy. Egypt had already spent millennia giving sacred shape to those themes. It knew how to turn royal bodies into symbols. It knew how to make succession feel cosmic. It knew how to surround death with the promise of transformation. But resemblance is not identity. The Grail is not hiding inside Egyptian kingship like a coded message waiting to be unlocked. What we find instead is a deeper pattern. Human societies repeatedly trying to make power sacred, death reversible, and inheritance meaningful. Egypt did this through pharaohs, gods, rituals, and monuments. Medieval Europe did it through knights, relics, purity, and Christian salvation. Modern conspiracy culture does it through bloodlines, secret societies, and missing archives. Different worlds, similar hunger. That hunger is the red thread, not proof of a hidden chalice, but proof of a recurring human desire to believe that legitimacy is not merely made by force, but carried through something deeper. A body, a name, a vessel, a lineage, a divine approval that cannot be voted away or easily destroyed. In ancient Egypt, that desire wore a crown. And once Alexander entered the Nile Valley, that crown would have to speak a new language. Chapter 4. The dynasty that made Egypt speak Greek. When Alexander of Macedon entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he did not arrive as a tourist in awe of antiquity. He came as a conqueror. But Egypt had a strange way of conquering its conquerors. Armies could take cities. Generals could seize treasuries. A foreign king could stand beneath the sun and declare himself master of the Nile. Yet to rule Egypt for more than a season, power had to be dressed in Egyptian form. It had to speak to priests. It had to honor temples. It had to understand that the land was not governed only by soldiers and taxes, but by rituals older than many kingdoms. Alexander seems to have understood this instinctively, or at least politically. He was recognized in Egyptian style, linked to divine kingship, and absorbed into the old grammar of authority. To the Greeks, he was the son of Philip, the brilliant commander who had broken the Persian Empire open. To Egypt, he could also be presented as a legitimate pharaoh. That double identity matters. It created a new kind of royal theater, where Greek ambition and Egyptian sacred kingship stood side by side, not always comfortably, but powerfully. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured among his generals, and Egypt passed into the hands of Ptolemy, one of his companions. Ptolemy did not merely govern Egypt as a province. He founded a dynasty. The Ptolemies would rule for nearly 3 centuries, and their Egypt became a world of layered meanings. Greek rulers wore Egyptian crowns. Egyptian temples continued to rise. Macedonian names entered a landscape of pharaohs and gods. The court spoke Greek, but the old religious forms did not disappear. They were used, adapted, performed, and sometimes sincerely honored. Egypt did not simply become Greek. It became bilingual in power, and at the center of this new world stood Alexandria. Alexandria was not built like the older sacred cities of Egypt. It did not grow slowly around a temple over centuries. It was planned with ambition, a city facing the Mediterranean, looking outward toward trade, empire, scholarship, and prestige. If Thebes belonged to the memory of divine kings, Alexandria belonged to the performance of cosmopolitan power. Ships came in from across the sea. Grain moved out. Languages collided in markets and official offices. Priests, sailors, scholars, tax collectors, diplomats, merchants, and soldiers passed through the same streets, each carrying a different version of the world. Here, Egypt was no longer only the land behind the desert. It was a meeting point. This is where the later Red Grail imagination finds one of its richest settings, though not because a grail was hidden there. The attraction lies in the mixture. Alexandria brought together royal blood, theology, politics, and scholarship in a way few ancient cities could. The Ptolemies needed to legitimize themselves to different audiences at once. To Greek elites, they had to appear heirs of Alexander and patrons of Hellenistic culture. To Egyptian priests, they had to appear as proper pharaohs who maintained the temples and honored the gods. To the wider Mediterranean, they wanted to appear magnificent, learned, wealthy, and inevitable. This produced a dynasty skilled in translation, not just translation of language, though that mattered deeply, but translation of authority. A Macedonian king could become an Egyptian pharaoh. A Greek city could sit inside an ancient sacred landscape. A royal house could borrow old symbols and make them serve new claims. Power became a kind of costume, but not a fake costume, more like a ceremonial garment, meaningful because people agreed to read it that way. The Ptolemies understood something all successful dynasties understand. Blood alone is rarely enough. It has to be narrated. A royal family must tell people why its blood matters. It must connect itself to gods, founders, victories, ancestors, or prophecies. It must make succession feel less like one powerful household protecting its privileges and more like the continuation of an order the world needs. In Egypt, this work could be done with extraordinary visual force. Temple walls could show a Greek-named ruler making offerings like a pharaoh of old. Priests could preserve continuity through ritual. The public image of sacred kingship could remain intact even as the court culture changed dramatically. That is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is how ancient legitimacy often worked. Modern people sometimes imagine identity as a clean category: Greek or Egyptian, foreign or native, political or religious. But the Ptolemaic world was not clean in that way. It was negotiated. A ruler could be foreign by ancestry and Egyptian by office. A temple could preserve ancient rites while benefiting from a dynasty with Mediterranean ambitions. A city could gather knowledge from many lands and still be tied to the grain fields of the Nile. This complexity is important because legends prefer simplicity. A conspiracy story wants a hidden line, a secret object, a single forbidden truth. Ptolemaic Egypt gives us something more difficult and more interesting: a society where symbols were constantly being reused, translated, and politically charged. In such a place, blood did not need to be hidden to become mysterious. It was already surrounded by ritual language. It was already turned into public meaning. And then there is Alexander himself, lingering over the dynasty like a ghost with excellent branding. The Ptolemies tied themselves to him because he was useful. His body, his memory, and his conquest gave their rule a heroic origin. In the ancient world, the possession of a founder's legacy could be almost as valuable as an army. It gave a dynasty a story larger than administration. Alexandria itself carried his name, and that name made the city feel destined for significance before its streets had fully filled with life. But destiny is often written after the fact. What we can say with more confidence is that Ptolemaic Egypt became a place where older Egyptian sacred kingship and newer Hellenistic monarchy were made to coexist. This did not erase tension. Greek-speaking elites and Egyptian traditions did not merge into one smooth civilization. There were divisions, hierarchies, and political pressures. But the ruling system depended on the careful management of those differences. The result was a kingdom unusually rich in symbolic possibility, a royal family claiming sacred authority, a capital devoted to knowledge and display, a priesthood preserving ancient forms, a Mediterranean court obsessed with lineage, succession, and image, a city where texts moved, myths met, and authority was constantly being interpreted. This is not evidence for the Grail. It is evidence for the kind of environment where later minds could imagine hidden meanings almost too easily. When a place contains multiple languages, overlapping religions, royal propaganda, and lost archives, it becomes vulnerable to romance. Missing records begin to feel intentional. Hybrid symbols begin to look like codes. Political rituals begin to look like clues to a secret doctrine. And Alexandria, more than any other city in Egypt, would become the perfect mirror for that temptation. Because once a city teaches the world to gather knowledge, it also teaches the world to mourn what knowledge has been lost. Chapter 5. Alexandria, City of Mirrors. Alexandria was a city built to be seen. It faced the Mediterranean like a declaration, not hidden inland among the older sacred centers, not folded quietly into the agricultural rhythm of the Nile, but placed at the edge of worlds, where ships could arrive carrying grain, ivory, glass, papyrus, gossip, philosophy, disease, perfume, royal news, and the occasional sailor who had heard far more than he understood. That last category should never be underestimated. Cities are not made only by architects and kings. They are made by repetition, by rumors told at docks, by translators arguing over meanings, by priests correcting foreigners, by merchants exaggerating distances, by scholars copying texts they only half trust, by officials sealing documents that may never be read again. Alexandria gathered all of this and gave it streets. It was not merely a capital, it was a machine for collecting the world. The Ptolemaic rulers understood the value of knowledge as spectacle. A kingdom could display wealth through gold, armies, processions, and stone. But Alexandria offered something subtler: the prestige of possession through understanding. To collect texts was to suggest that nothing worth knowing lay beyond the reach of the court. To sponsor scholars was to make intelligence part of royal image. To organize learning under royal patronage was to turn curiosity into a political instrument. The famous Library of Alexandria has become so large in memory that it is almost impossible to see clearly. In popular imagination, it often appears as one perfect storehouse of all ancient knowledge, later destroyed in one clean tragedy, as if history misplaced its greatest hard drive. The real story is less tidy. There were institutions, collections, losses, fires, transfers, rivalries, and long decay. The idea of the library may now be more complete than the library ever was. But that is exactly why it matters. Alexandria became a symbol of gathered knowledge, and symbols do not need tidy facts to become powerful. They need emotional shape. The library represents everything we wish had survived. Books never copied, histories never repeated, scientific observations lost to damp and war and neglect, religious arguments preserved only through their enemies, names of women and foreigners and minor thinkers erased because no one later thought them important enough to save. A city devoted to knowledge also becomes a city haunted by absence. That is the mirror Alexandria holds up to us. We admire what it collected, then immediately imagine what it lost. And in that gap, secrecy begins to breathe. Not necessarily real secrecy, not always. Sometimes lost records are just lost records. Papyrus decays, buildings are repurposed, courts fall. Archives become fuel, bedding, trash, or nothing at all. Ancient people were not preserving the past for modern documentaries. They were living inside their own emergencies. Still, Alexandria encourages suspicion because it had all the ingredients a mystery requires. There were temples where Egyptian ritual continued under Greek-speaking rulers. There were scholars comparing texts and traditions. There were royal courts where succession could mean survival or execution. There were ports where news traveled faster than certainty. There were priests who knew how to read older signs, and administrators who knew the power of controlling what was written down. There were communities speaking different languages close enough to misunderstand one another with confidence. That last detail is important. Misunderstanding is one of history's great engines. A word translated too smoothly can lose its edge. A ritual described by an outsider can become exotic theater. A local myth retold for a foreign audience can shift its meaning without anyone intending deception. Alexandria was full of people trying to make one world intelligible to another. That work produced brilliance. It also produced distortion. Think of a scroll entering the city. Before it becomes knowledge, it passes through hands. Someone acquires it. Someone identifies it. Someone decides whether it is worth copying. Someone reads it through the assumptions of a language, a class, a religion, a political moment. If it is translated, another layer appears. If it is summarized, another. If it is quoted by an opponent, another still. By the time a text survives to us, it may have crossed so many thresholds that we are not holding a window into the past, but a window made from older windows. Alexandria specialized in those thresholds. This is why the city is so tempting for anyone hunting a hidden Grail tradition. It feels plausible as a crossroads where sacred vessels, royal blood, resurrection myths, and later religious ideas might have brushed against each other. A Greek scholar could encounter an Egyptian priest. A Jewish text could be discussed in Greek. Egyptian divine kingship could exist near Mediterranean monarchy. Later, Christian thinkers would inherit a region already trained in argument, translation, and layered symbolism. But plausibility is not proof. It is only an atmosphere in which proof might be imagined. And Alexandria's atmosphere has misled many people. Because we know so much was written there, we assume something decisive must have been written there about every mystery we care about. Because so much was lost, we assume the missing piece must support our favorite theory. Because the city contained priests and scholars, we imagine secret initiations where ordinary bureaucracy may have done most of the work. Because ancient people loved symbols, we forget that not every symbol was waiting to be decoded by us. The city becomes a mirror, and the viewer appears inside it. A medievalist sees echoes of romance. A theologian sees early doctrine. A conspiracy writer sees suppression. An archaeologist sees layers, materials, dates, and contexts. A storyteller sees the most dangerous thing of all, a setting where almost anything can be made to feel possible. Yet Alexandria should not be reduced to a playground for speculation. Its real wonder is stronger than that. Here was a city where knowledge became imperial ambition, where the act of collecting texts was also a way of collecting authority, where scholars could work under royal protection, but never entirely outside royal power, where temples preserved older forms while the court advertised itself through Greek culture, where the sea brought in the wider world, and the Nile reminded everyone that Egypt was not merely a Mediterranean kingdom with exotic scenery. It was a living negotiation. Even the city's light, in memory, feels double. The great lighthouse, the pharaohs, guided ships toward safety. But it also announced power from a distance. It said, "Here is a harbor, here is a kingdom, here is a place that can afford to turn stone and fire into a message visible across water." A lighthouse is practical, yes. But in Alexandria, practicality and symbolism rarely traveled separately. That is the key to the city. Everything meant more than one thing. A library was a scholarly institution and a royal boast. A temple was a religious site and a political bridge. A translation was a tool of understanding and a quiet transformation. A king was a Macedonian ruler and an Egyptian pharaoh. A scroll was a text and a possession. A port was an economic engine and an intelligence network. A rumor was entertainment until someone powerful believed it. In such a place, secrecy did not need to hide in underground chambers. It could live in plain sight, inside the distance between what one group meant and another group heard. This is the Alexandria that matters for our red thread. Not a fantasy city guarding a chalice beneath marble floors, but a real city where meanings were constantly reflected, refracted, and rearranged. A city where knowledge was treasured enough to become political, and fragile enough to become myth after it disappeared. If Egypt gave sacred kingship its ancient grammar, Alexandria gave that grammar new mirrors. And once royal blood enters a hall of mirrors, it rarely comes out looking simple. Chapter 6. Queens, Pharaohs, and the Politics of Blood. Royal blood is never just biology. In a palace, blood becomes a story people are expected to believe. It is arranged through marriage, protected through ritual, polished through public image, and repeated until it feels less like a family claim and more like the natural order of the world. The Ptolemies understood this with unusual intensity. Their dynasty did not survive simply because it had soldiers, ships, and money. It survived because it learned how to make ancestry perform. For a Macedonian family ruling an ancient Egyptian kingdom, legitimacy had to be manufactured in several languages at once. To Greek subjects, the Ptolemies could present themselves as heirs of Alexander's world. Royal, educated, victorious, connected to the wider Hellenistic Mediterranean. To Egyptian priests and temple communities, they had to appear as pharaohs in the proper sacred pattern, offering to the gods, maintaining the temples, upholding order, standing in the long line of kings who had made Egypt intelligible to itself for thousands of years. This meant the dynasty lived behind masks, but not necessarily false ones. A mask in ancient politics was not always a deception. Sometimes it was the office itself. A ruler became what the ritual required him to become. The crown, the cartouche, the offering scene, the royal titulary. These did not merely decorate authority. They produced it. They told the world how to see the person underneath. And for the Ptolemies, the person underneath was often caught inside a family machine that could be brutal. The dynasty became known for sibling marriage, rival claims, palace intrigue, competing queens, and repeated struggles over succession. To a modern viewer, some of this can feel like a scandalous footnote, the sort of detail used to make ancient royalty seem decadent or strange. But it had a political function. Marrying within the royal family could concentrate legitimacy. It could prevent outsiders from claiming too much influence. It could imitate, or at least echo, divine pairings familiar from Egyptian religious imagination, where gods and goddesses often existed in sacred family relationships. That does not mean every such marriage was pious, romantic, or stable. Dynastic strategy rarely cares about comfort. It cares about continuity. This is where the politics of blood becomes almost theatrical. A royal marriage was not only a private union, it was a public argument. It announced who belonged inside the sacred circle and who did not. It told subjects that the next ruler would not be a rupture, but an extension of the same consecrated house. The body of the queen, especially, could become central to this argument. Queens in Ptolemaic Egypt were not background figures embroidered onto the edge of power. Some were visible, wealthy, ritually significant, and politically dangerous. They could serve as wives, sisters, mothers, co-rulers, rivals, patrons, symbols of continuity, and sometimes the clearest face of dynastic legitimacy. In a royal house where male succession was not always clean, a queen's lineage could matter enormously. This is one of the details modern bloodline stories often distort. They imagine blood as a hidden substance, moving quietly through generations like a secret preserved in the dark. But in royal politics, blood had to be displayed. It had to be staged. A queen's ancestry mattered because people could point to it, invoke it, carve it, celebrate it, and use it. The legitimacy was not hidden beneath history. It was performed before witnesses, and yet performance does not make it simple. The Ptolemaic court could turn sacred inheritance into public spectacle while also concealing the uglier mechanics behind it. A polished statue does not show the argument that commissioned it. A temple relief does not show the fear of assassination. A royal title does not show the negotiations, resentments, and compromises needed to make it acceptable. Official imagery has a way of smoothing violence into ceremony. That may be why dynastic history feels so close to myth. Not because it is unreal, but because rulers spend so much effort making reality look inevitable. Consider the queen as an image. She could be presented in Greek style, linked to Hellenistic ideals of royal femininity and courtly prestige. She could also be associated with Egyptian religious forms, appearing within a sacred landscape where queenship had older meanings. The same woman could be legible to different communities in different ways. To one audience, she was part of a Macedonian royal house. To another, she might participate in the visual grammar of pharaonic rule. Her power depended partly on that doubleness. Alexandria sharpened this effect. In the capital, royal image became almost a kind of currency. Processions, coinage, cult honors, public ceremonies, and court culture turned the dynasty into something people could see and repeat. A ruler's face on a coin traveled farther than a speech. A cult title could make loyalty feel devotional. A public festival could transform political hierarchy into shared experience. The Ptolemies did not simply govern bodies, they governed attention. That is a quieter form of power, but it may be the more lasting one. When people later look back and imagine secret sacred bloodlines, they are often responding to the residue of this old royal theater. They sense, correctly, that ancient monarchy invested blood with meaning. They sense that ancestry could be sacred, that marriage could be symbolic, that queens could carry legitimacy in ways not always obvious from a list of kings. But then the modern imagination takes a dangerous step. It assumes that because blood mattered, there must have been one hidden bloodline that mattered above all others. The evidence does not support that kind of clean mystery. What we see instead is messier. A dynasty repeatedly trying to stabilize itself by controlling the story of descent. Blood mattered because it could justify rule, but it did not magically remove ambition, resentment, incompetence, or chance. A sacred family could still tear itself apart. A queen could be revered in image and threatened in practice. A child could inherit a throne and become a symbol before becoming a person. Royal blood did not solve politics. It made politics more symbolic. And symbolism can be both beautiful and merciless. A crown placed on the wrong head can make a kingdom nervous. A marriage arranged for continuity can breed rivalry. A title meant to declare unity can expose division. The more sacred a dynasty claims to be, the more dangerous its internal cracks become, because every family dispute begins to look like a disturbance in the order of the world. This is why Ptolemaic Egypt is so important to the trail we are following. It shows us a society where blood, ritual, gender, ancestry, and public belief were bound together openly. It gives us a real historical setting in which sacred inheritance was not a fantasy, but a tool of government. But again, the tool is not the Grail. The Ptolemies were not guarding a crimson vessel of secret salvation. They were doing something more human and in some ways more revealing. They were trying to make a foreign dynasty feel eternal. They were using the languages available to them. Greek monarchy, Egyptian kingship, divine association, family continuity, queenly image, to persuade a complicated kingdom that their rule belonged to the deep order of things. That persuasion required splendor. It required scholarship. It required ritual. Sometimes it required marriage so close to the center of the family that modern readers still pause over it. Sometimes it required removing rivals from memory or from life. The sacred and the ruthless were not opposites here. They often worked together. And perhaps that is why later legends cling to royal blood so stubbornly. Blood promises purity, but history shows negotiation. Blood promises destiny, but dynasties survive through strategy. Blood promises a hidden truth, but the ancient world more often gives us public ceremonies covering private fear. In Ptolemaic Egypt, power did not simply flow through veins. It was rehearsed, costumed, translated, and defended. And once blood had been made sacred on the stage of monarchy, it was only a short, symbolic step toward older myths of death, restoration, and the vessel that holds life together. Chapter 7. Isis, Osiris, and the vessel of resurrection. Before a vessel can become holy, a culture must first believe that something precious can be held, not merely stored, held, protected from decay, gathered after violence, kept safe through the long passage between death and return. Ancient Egypt knew that idea intimately. Its religion was filled with containers of meaning: coffins, shrines, jars, temples, tombs, wombs, names, bodies wrapped and guarded against disappearance. The Egyptians did not treat preservation as a small, practical matter. Preservation was a form of hope. To keep something intact was to resist the chaos that threatened to scatter the world. And no myth expresses that struggle more powerfully than the story of Isis and Osiris. The details vary across time and telling, as myths often do. But the central shape is clear enough. Osiris, a divine king, is murdered. His body is broken, hidden, or scattered. Isis searches for him. She mourns, gathers, restores, and through her devotion, life answers death. Osiris does not simply return to ordinary life as if nothing happened. He becomes lord of the afterlife, a transformed king, a presence beyond the visible world. From this restoration comes Horus, the son who will claim kingship among the living. It is difficult to overstate how much this myth mattered. It was not just a story about gods behaving dramatically, though they certainly had a talent for that. It gave Egypt a sacred pattern for death, succession, mourning, and renewal. The dead could be associated with Osiris. The living king could be associated with Horus. The wounded continuity of kingship could be imagined as repaired through divine order. Loss did not have to be meaningless. It could be gathered into ritual. This is where the later Grail imagination begins to hear echoes: a wounded king, a sacred vessel, blood as life, death answered by restoration, a search that is also a test of understanding. These themes are not identical across Egyptian myth and medieval Grail romance, but they do begin to rhyme. And rhymes are powerful. They can make separate traditions feel secretly related, even when no direct historical line can be proven. That is the delicate place where interpretation must remain honest. It would be too easy to say that the Grail is really Egyptian, that the cup of medieval romance descends from a lost Osirian vessel, that Isis guarded the original secret later hidden in Christian legend. Easy, but unsupported. The evidence does not allow that kind of clean announcement. What it allows is more subtle and perhaps more interesting. Ancient Egypt preserved a deep symbolic language around containment, restoration, divine kingship, and sacred life. Later, Grail traditions developed their own language around the vessel, blood, salvation, purity, and the healing of a broken realm. The two worlds do not need to be the same for the comparison to matter. Symbols travel in complicated ways. Sometimes they travel through texts, sometimes through trade, sometimes through conquest, translation, ritual borrowing, or religious reinterpretation. Sometimes they do not travel at all. They reappear because human beings keep returning to the same fears. Death takes, power fails, bodies break, dynasties end, memory fades. So cultures invent forms that promise gathering: the tomb, the cup, the shrine, the book, the bloodline, the name spoken aloud. A vessel becomes more than an object because it answers a human terror. It says, "Not everything will be lost." In the myth of Isis, the act of gathering is central. She is not only a mourner, she is a restorer. Her power lies partly in refusing fragmentation. Where violence has turned a king into absence, she performs the sacred labor of making meaning whole again. This is not the same as the Christian Grail, but it sits near one of the Grail's later emotional centers. The Grail, too, becomes associated with restoration of the soul of the wounded, of a kingdom that has gone barren or wrong. Yet the Egyptian imagination is not focused on a knight's moral quest. It is focused on cosmic repair. The question is not whether one individual is pure enough to behold the mystery. The question is whether life can be reassembled after disorder has torn it apart. That difference matters. Medieval Grail stories often turn inward. The seeker must be worthy. He must ask the right question, or fail because he does not understand what he sees. The Grail tests the spiritual condition of the human soul. Egyptian resurrection imagery moves through ritual, divine precedent, and the maintenance of order. It is less about one hero proving himself and more about the universe being restored through sacred pattern. Still, later readers looking backward might blur these distinctions. They see a vessel. They see blood. They see a dead and restored divine figure. They see sacred kingship passing from father to son. And suddenly, the distance between Osiris and the Grail feels smaller than it is. This is how myths become bridges. A bridge does not prove that two lands are the same. It only allows the imagination to cross between them. The red in the Red Grail is important here, because red is not a neutral color in the symbolic mind. It can suggest blood, danger, vitality, violence, desert, sunset, royal power, sacrifice, even warning. In Egyptian contexts, red could carry associations that were not simply holy. It could be tied to disorder, heat, and threatening force depending on the setting. In Christian and Grail-inflected imagination, red often pulls us toward blood, martyrdom, sacrifice, and sacred inheritance. The color itself becomes unstable, able to darken or sanctify depending on who is telling the story. That instability is why the Red Grail works so well as a rumor. It does not need one fixed meaning. It survives by gathering meanings around itself. Egyptian divine kingship gives it ancestry. Osirian resurrection gives it death and restoration. Christian memory gives it blood and salvation. Medieval romance gives it a quest. Modern conspiracy gives it secrecy. Each layer adds emotional force, even when the historical connections remain thin. And this is where a careful storyteller has to resist the most tempting move. The temptation is to turn symbolic resemblance into hidden continuity, to say, here, finally, is the proof. The vessel was always Egyptian. The blood was always royal. The resurrection was always encoded, but the more responsible reading is quieter. The symbols are not evidence of one buried artifact. They are evidence of recurring sacred grammar. Blood means life because bodies teach us that it does. A vessel means preservation because fragile things need holding. Resurrection matters because death is the oldest interruption. Kingship becomes sacred because power wants a reason larger than force. These ideas did not belong to one civilization alone. Egypt gave them one of their most majestic and long-lasting forms. Medieval Christianity and Arthurian literature gave them another. The modern Red Grail rumor is born not from a single ancient object, but from the emotional charge that appears when those forms are placed beside one another. That does not make the rumor meaningless. It makes it revealing. The Red Grail shows us how people read history when the evidence is incomplete. We look for patterns. We connect images. We turn separate traditions into a sequence because sequence feels safer than coincidence. We prefer a hidden design to a messy inheritance of stories, translations, borrowings, and accidental survivals. But Egypt, at its best, teaches another lesson. It teaches that symbols can be profound without being literal. Isis does not have to be guarding a medieval chalice for her myth to illuminate why sacred vessels matter. Osiris does not have to be a coded Grail king for his restoration to help us understand why later cultures imagined holiness as something broken and gathered again. The vessel of resurrection is not one object. It is a human pattern. The hope that what has been scattered might still be made whole. And in Egypt, that hope was written not only in myth, but in tombs, temples, royal bodies, and the careful preservation of words that would one day sleep beneath the desert. Chapter 8. The Hidden Texts of the Desert. There are stories the desert destroys, and then there are stories the desert accidentally protects. Egypt has always lived between those two truths. The same climate that can bleach a monument into ruin can also preserve a scrap of writing long after a wetter country would have swallowed it. The same sand that covers a settlement can become a seal. The same isolation that hides a monastery, a tomb, or a jar of manuscripts can keep it waiting past the fall of empires, past the change of languages, past the people who once knew exactly what it meant. This is where Egypt becomes more than a land of temples and royal bodies. It becomes an archive with no proper catalog. Some of its records were carved for eternity. Others survived by accident, buried in jars, copied by monks, reused in bindings, abandoned in caves, or carried into communities that history later pushed to the margins. And because these writings often concern religion, revelation, and authority, they have a special power over the imagination. A lost shopping list can charm historians. A lost gospel can unsettle the world. That difference matters. When a religious text emerges from the ground, people do not treat it like a neutral object. They ask what it proves, what it threatens, who hid it, who feared it, whether it contains the real version of a story later edited by power. Sometimes those questions are useful. Sometimes they are too eager. The desert gives us fragments, but modern hunger wants confessions. One of the most famous examples is the discovery near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt in 1945, where a collection of ancient codices was found buried in a jar. The details of the discovery have been retold many times, sometimes with embellishments. But the importance of the manuscripts is not in doubt. They preserved writings associated with early Christian and Gnostic traditions. texts that revealed a far more diverse religious landscape than many people had imagined from the later Orthodox record alone. Here was not a single lost key to all Christian origins. It was something more complicated. Evidence that early religious thought was full of argument, experimentation, visionary language, competing claims about salvation, and different ways of understanding Jesus, creation, the soul, and divine knowledge. The Nag Hammadi texts did not overturn all history in one dramatic gesture. They made the history less tidy, and that is often what real discoveries do. They do not hand us the answer we wanted. They widen the room. For our red thread, Nag Hammadi matters because it shows how Egypt could preserve sacred writings that later generations had not centered, approved, or fully remembered. It gives a grounded example of buried texts reshaping modern understanding, but it does not prove every legend that tries to attach itself to the phrase hidden gospel. It does not prove a secret bloodline. It does not prove an Egyptian Grail tradition. It does not prove that everything rejected by later religious authorities was more authentic than what survived openly. That last point is worth lingering over, because it is where many modern mysteries lose their balance. There is a common instinct to assume that suppressed equals true. If a text was hidden, it must have been dangerous. If it was dangerous, it must have contained the real secret. If it contained the real secret, then official history must be a cover story. That chain of thought is emotionally satisfying, but historically unstable. Texts disappear for many reasons. They may be controversial. They may be obsolete. They may belong to a community that vanished. They may be copied less often because fewer people valued them. They may be hidden during conflict. They may be buried as sacred objects. They may survive simply because a jar remained unbroken. Survival is not always endorsement. Loss is not always conspiracy. Still, the hidden texts of Egypt changed the way we think, because they remind us that the past was not as unified as later summaries make it seem. Early Christianity in Egypt especially was not a single quiet stream flowing neatly into later doctrine. It was a terrain of communities, teachers, ascetics, bishops, translators, monks, theologians, and dissenting voices. Some wrote in Greek, some in Coptic. Some preserved older ideas in new language. Some argued over the nature of Christ, the body, knowledge, salvation, scripture, authority, and the shape of the spiritual life. Coptic tradition is especially important here, as the Egyptian language written in an alphabet largely based on Greek. Coptic became a vehicle for Christian thought in Egypt. It carried scripture, sermons, monastic writings, theological disputes, prayers, and stories of saints. It also carried traces of a world in transition, where ancient Egyptian linguistic inheritance met Christian belief. The result was not a simple replacement of one civilization by another. It was a long process of transformation, and transformation leaves seams. Those seams are where rumor likes to enter. A manuscript in Coptic feels to many modern readers closer to the secret heart of Egypt than a Latin manuscript in a European library. A buried jar feels more mysterious than a text transmitted in monasteries. A gospel outside the standard canon feels automatically explosive, even when its actual contents are mystical, theological, difficult, or deeply symbolic rather than scandalous in the tabloid sense. The imagination wants hidden history to speak plainly. Real hidden texts often speak in riddles, visions, arguments, and theological vocabulary that does not behave like a modern thriller. That is part of their value. They resist being reduced to one simple claim. When we look at these desert-preserved writings honestly, they teach us caution and curiosity at the same time. Caution, because every fragment must be dated, translated, contextualized, compared, and interpreted with care. Curiosity, because even a damaged text can show us that ancient religious life was richer than the surviving official map. A single codex can reveal a community of thought. A translation can show what ideas traveled. A buried collection can force scholars to ask why certain voices were remembered and others fell away. But there is a difference between expanding history and replacing it with fantasy. The Red Grail myth often feeds on the romance of hidden manuscripts. It imagines that somewhere in the desert lies the text that will finally connect Egyptian kingship, Christian blood, sacred vessels, and forbidden lineage into one complete revelation. The idea is seductive because it turns history into a locked-room mystery. There is a missing document. Someone hid it. Find it, and the whole world changes. Real history is rarely so considerate. A manuscript may change a field without solving a legend. It may complicate doctrine without exposing a master conspiracy. It may show disagreement without revealing a secret dynasty. The Nag Hammadi discovery did not matter because it confirmed every modern suspicion. It mattered because it forced a more honest view of early religious diversity. That is a quieter revolution, but a deeper one. Egypt's buried texts are not props in a Grail hunt. They are witnesses to the fragility of memory. They show how easily a tradition can be narrowed by survival, authority, translation, and time. They also show how much can remain unknown, not because someone designed an elaborate cover-up, but because history is made of human communities that rise, argue, write, copy, decay, and vanish. And yet, one can understand why the fantasy persists. To hold a manuscript rescued from the desert is to feel the past become physical, not abstract, not distant. Ink touched by a hand. A page once turned by someone who believed the words mattered. A book buried before it was forgotten, or forgotten because it was buried. That intimacy is powerful. It makes the centuries feel thin. So the hidden texts of Egypt do not give us the Red Grail. They give us the conditions that make people believe such a thing might be waiting. A land where sacred writings really were buried. A Christian world more diverse than later memory allowed. A language that carried ancient Egypt into a new faith. A desert capable of hiding not only bones and temples, but arguments about the soul. The secret, in the end, may not be that one forbidden truth was buried beneath the sand. It may be that many truths were buried there, none of them simple, each one making the past harder and more human than legend prefers. Chapter 9. When Christianity reached the Nile, Christianity did not arrive in Egypt as a completed monument. It arrived as a living argument. By the time the new faith took root along the Nile, Egypt was already trained in sacred complexity. Greek philosophy had passed through Alexandria. Jewish scripture had been read, translated, debated, and interpreted there. Egyptian religious memory still lingered in language, landscape, and ritual imagination. The city had ports, schools, scribes, temples, and restless minds. It was not the kind of place where an idea stayed simple for long. Later tradition associates the arrival of Christianity in Egypt with Mark the Evangelist, though the earliest details remain difficult to pin down with certainty. What can be said more confidently is that Egypt became one of the great centers of early Christian thought. Not a quiet edge of the Christian world, but one of its laboratories. Here, doctrine was sharpened, scripture was argued over, ascetic life took radical form. Questions about Christ, creation, the soul, martyrdom, authority, and salvation were not abstract puzzles. They shaped communities. Alexandria was especially important because it knew how to think in layers. A Christian teacher there could inherit Jewish scripture, speak in Greek philosophical terms, live under Roman power, and breathe the air of an Egyptian landscape where divine kingship, resurrection, judgment, and sacred writing had long mattered. This does not mean Christianity in Egypt was secretly Egyptian religion wearing a new robe. That would be too crude. But it does mean the faith developed in a place where old symbolic habits did not simply vanish overnight. Religions do not move into empty rooms. They enter houses already furnished by memory. For some believers, Egypt became a place of refuge. The Gospel of Matthew had already placed the child Jesus in Egypt during the flight from Herod, giving the land a role in Christian imagination that was not merely geographical. Egypt could be remembered as shelter, as testing ground, as wilderness, as inheritance. It could evoke both bondage and deliverance through the story of Exodus, and refuge through the story of the Holy Family. No single meaning held the whole country still. That doubleness made Egypt unusually rich as sacred territory. It was the land of ancient gods, but also the land where Christianity learned to speak in desert accents. It was the land of pharaohs, but also of monks. It was the land of temples, but also of churches carved into communities of discipline, prayer, and refusal. The old monuments remained, not always understood in their original terms, but still present. A Christian Egypt did not erase ancient Egypt as if wiping ink from a tablet. It lived beside its remains, sometimes rejecting them, sometimes reinterpreting them, sometimes simply passing them on the road. The desert became central to this transformation. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, Egyptian monasticism helped change Christian spirituality. Figures such as Antony became associated with the radical withdrawal into desert life, not as an escape into emptiness, but as a confrontation with the self, temptation, discipline, and God. Pachomius is remembered for helping shape communal monastic life, where renunciation became organized, shared, and structured. These movements were not marginal curiosities. They influenced Christian practice far beyond Egypt. This is one of the great ironies of the Nile. A civilization famous for monumental burial also became a birthplace of spiritual living death. Men and women leaving ordinary society in order to die to ambition, appetite, status, and distraction. The desert, which had preserved bodies, now became a place where souls were tested. It offered no courtly Grail quest, no knight riding through enchanted forests. But the emotional structure is not entirely alien. A seeker leaves the known world, confronts hidden disorder, and hopes to return transformed. Again, resemblance is not identity, but it helps explain why Egypt later attracted stories about forbidden sacred history. The country had real deserts, real monks, real manuscripts, real theological disputes, and real traditions that did not always fit neatly into later summaries. It did not need invented tunnels beneath every monastery. Its documented history was already full of tension. Early Christianity in Egypt also became a battleground of ideas. Some disputes centered on questions that may sound technical today, but in their own time carried immense spiritual and political force. What was the nature of Christ? How could Jesus be both divine and human? What kind of authority did bishops hold? Which writings should be read as scripture? Which teachings endangered the faith? And who had the right to decide? These questions shaped councils, exiles, communities, and sometimes imperial policy. When people today imagine suppressed writings, they often picture a neat conspiracy, one powerful institution hiding one dangerous truth. The reality is more tangled. Early Christian communities disagreed intensely. Some texts were copied because communities cherished them. Others faded because they were rejected, neglected, disputed, or simply not preserved. Labels such as orthodox and heretical were not just descriptions. They were weapons in arguments over identity and survival. Egypt stood close to many of these arguments. The Nag Hammadi texts, Coptic translations, monastic writings, theological controversies, and Alexandrian scholarship reveal a region where Christianity was intellectually alive and internally diverse. That diversity does not automatically validate modern bloodline theories. It does not mean every excluded text contains a hidden historical report. Many of these writings are visionary, symbolic, theological, and deeply concerned with salvation and knowledge, not with royal genealogy. But they do show why Egypt became a magnet. A place with buried manuscripts invites the hope of missing proof. A place with ancient kingship invites speculation about sacred blood. A place with early Christian diversity invites suspicion that later doctrine concealed something. A place with deserts and monasteries invites images of hidden guardians, secret libraries, and truths passed from hand to hand outside official power. Some of that attraction is understandable. History really did narrow, not always through malice, but through selection. What was copied survived. What was translated could travel. What was condemned might vanish or survive only in hostile summaries. What was buried might wait long enough to surprise the modern world. The past we inherit is not the full past. It is the surviving past. That fact is humbling. It is also dangerous, because once we accept that records are incomplete, imagination rushes in to complete them. The missing gospel becomes the one that proves our suspicion. The destroyed archive becomes the place where the real story was kept. The monk becomes a guardian. The jar becomes a vault. Egypt becomes not a historical region, but a vast locked cabinet, and every gap in the record becomes a keyhole. The more honest question is not, was there a secret bloodline hidden in Egypt? The more honest question is, why does Egypt make hidden versions of sacred history feel believable? The answer lies partly in the country's unusual continuity. Ancient religion, Hellenistic scholarship, Jewish interpretation, Roman rule, Christian theology, Coptic language, desert monasticism, and manuscript survival all overlapped there in ways that make Egypt feel like a crossroads of origins. It was old enough to lend authority, Christian enough to matter to sacred history, and mysterious enough in modern imagination to absorb almost any rumor. But mystery should not be allowed to do all the work. Egypt's Christian past is valuable without forcing it to confess to a legend it does not support. Its real hidden histories are not necessarily about royal descendants smuggled through time. They are about communities arguing over God, monks remaking the meaning of holiness, translators carrying belief into new language, and manuscripts surviving long enough to remind us that no tradition begins as tidy as later memory pretends. That may be why the Nile keeps drawing the forbidden story back. Not because it holds a single secret bloodline waiting to be named, but because it preserves something more unsettling. Proof that sacred history was never as simple as the version carved onto the surface. Chapter 10. The bloodline that history cannot hold. The idea of a holy bloodline is powerful because it sounds almost reasonable at first. Religions have founders. Families preserve memory. Dynasties guard ancestry. Scriptures contain silences. Medieval romances love coded quests. Ancient Egypt treated royal descent as sacred. Put these pieces on a table, lower the light, and a pattern begins to appear whether or not the pieces were ever meant to fit. That is the danger of a beautiful theory. It can make coincidence feel like architecture. The modern holy bloodline idea does not come to us as an ancient Egyptian tradition preserved intact across the centuries. It is a later construction, assembled from fragments that originally belonged to different worlds. One piece comes from Christian memory, the blood of Christ, the cup of the Last Supper, the passion, sacrifice, redemption. Another piece comes from medieval Grail romance, the mysterious vessel, the chosen seeker, the hidden meaning, the wounded kingdom waiting to be healed. Another comes from royal genealogy, the old belief that blood can carry legitimacy through time. And another comes from modern suspicion, the belief that official history must be hiding the most important thing. Once these elements are fused, the Grail changes shape. It is no longer only a vessel. It becomes a lineage. In this reading, holy blood is treated not simply as sacred blood shed in sacrifice, but as blood passed through descendants. The cup becomes symbolic of a body, or a womb, or a family line. The quest becomes less about spiritual transformation and more about uncovering forbidden ancestry. The mystery moves from chapel to archive, from relic to genealogy, from salvation to inheritance. It is a clever transformation. That does not make it ancient. What makes the idea so seductive is that genealogy feels like evidence even when it is being used imaginatively. A family tree has lines, names, dates, marriages, heirs. It looks orderly. It promises continuity. It gives the impression that the past can be followed like a road if we simply keep tracing backward. But genealogy is also one of the easiest places for wishful thinking to dress itself as research. Names repeat. Records vanish. Noble families invent impressive ancestors. Medieval chroniclers sometimes wrote to flatter patrons or explain power after the fact. A marriage alliance can be inflated into destiny. A vague connection can become a secret tradition if the storyteller has enough confidence and the listener has enough desire. This is not a small problem. It sits at the center of the bloodline myth. To prove an ancient sacred lineage, one would need an unbroken chain of evidence across centuries of war, migration, religious conflict, manuscript loss, political reinvention, and ordinary human confusion. Not just symbolic resemblance, not just suggestive names, not just a family claiming old importance, not just a legend written long after the supposed events. One would need documents strong enough to survive scrutiny, and those documents would need to agree with the wider historical context. The evidence is thinner than the story wants it to be. That does not stop the story from growing. In fact, weakness can make a legend more flexible. A well-documented fact has limits. It must stay where the evidence puts it. A poorly documented rumor can travel almost anywhere. It can hide in lost archives, destroyed libraries, suppressed gospels, erased queens, secret societies, coded paintings, and desert manuscripts no one has conveniently found yet. The bloodline that history cannot hold is not held by history at all. It is held by desire, and desire is not always foolish. Sometimes it begins with a reasonable discomfort. People notice that official histories often favor the powerful. They notice that women are erased more easily than men. They notice that religious institutions have fought over texts, doctrines, and authority. They notice that conquest can bury local memory. They notice that archives are incomplete. These are valid instincts. A careful historian shares many of them. But suspicion becomes dangerous when it stops asking for evidence and begins treating absence as proof. If a document is missing, perhaps it was destroyed because it contained the truth. If a woman is not mentioned, perhaps she was deliberately erased because she was central. If a symbol resembles another symbol, perhaps they belong to the same secret code. If a legend appears late, perhaps it was preserved orally in perfect silence for centuries. Each step may sound possible, but possibility is not the same as probability, and probability is not proof. This distinction is not glamorous, but it keeps the past from becoming a puppet. The holy bloodline idea often depends on a kind of historical alchemy. Scripture becomes genealogy. Metaphor becomes biology. Romance becomes archive. Egypt becomes the ancient vault that gives the whole construction weight. The Nile is brought into the story because it offers age, mystery, sacred kingship, hidden texts, and a visual language of death and rebirth. It feels like the right place for a forbidden origin, even when the actual trail does not lead there. That feeling is part of the myth's machinery. Egypt gives the bloodline story depth. Medieval Europe gives it narrative form. Christianity gives it sacred intensity. Modern conspiracy culture gives it enemies, cover-ups, and the thrill of forbidden knowledge. Without Egypt, the story may feel too recent. Without the Grail, it may feel too abstract. Without Christianity, it may lack emotional charge. Without conspiracy, it may lack suspense. Together, they create a myth that feels older than its own construction. But when we separate the layers, something more honest appears. Ancient Egypt did have sacred kingship, but not a documented Grail lineage. Medieval Grail literature did develop powerful Christian meanings, but not as an Egyptian royal archive. Early Christianity in Egypt did produce diverse texts and intense debate, but those writings do not establish a hidden dynastic bloodline. Genealogical speculation can be fascinating, but fascination is not verification. The modern bloodline story survives because it solves an emotional problem, not a historical one. It turns faith into ancestry. It turns mystery into inheritance. It turns the uncertainty of the past into a secret design moving beneath events. For some people, that is irresistible. A spiritual truth can feel too intangible. A bloodline feels physical. It has bodies, children, descendants, names. It suggests that the sacred did not vanish into doctrine or ritual, but continued quietly through human veins. It makes holiness biological, trackable, almost possessible. There is something revealing in that need. Modern culture often distrusts institutions but still longs for legitimacy. It questions official religion but still wants contact with the sacred. It doubts royal authority but remains fascinated by hidden heirs. The holy bloodline myth satisfies all of these contradictions at once. It attacks authority while creating a new, more secret authority. It rejects official history while claiming to reveal the true one. It seems rebellious, yet it often depends on the oldest aristocratic fantasy of all. That blood makes someone special. That irony should not be missed. A story that appears to liberate sacred history from institutions may quietly rebuild sacred privilege through ancestry. And Egypt, once again, becomes the grand backdrop. Pharaohs, queens, temples, desert manuscripts, Alexandria, Isis, Osiris. All are pulled toward a modern hunger they did not create. Their symbols are recruited into a drama about forbidden lineage. But the more we examine the pieces, the more the Red Grail begins to look less like an inherited secret and more like a mirror of modern desire. The question is no longer whether history can hold the bloodline. It cannot, at least not with the evidence we have. The better question is why the idea remains so hard to release. Perhaps because it offers what ordinary history rarely gives, a single hidden thread connecting body, faith, royalty, and destiny. Real history is scattered. It breaks. It contradicts itself. It leaves women unnamed, children unrecorded, manuscripts damaged, motives uncertain, and endings unresolved. The bloodline myth repairs all of that with one crimson line. But repair is not the same as truth. And the next shadow in this story shows what can happen when the longing for hidden history becomes so strong that someone begins manufacturing the evidence it lacks. Chapter 11. The Priory Shadow. The most dangerous myths do not always begin in temples. Sometimes they begin in filing cabinets, not in a hidden chamber beneath Alexandria, not in a sealed tomb with a crimson seal, not in the hands of a dying monk whispering the name of a forbidden heir. Sometimes a legend begins with paper, typed pages, invented genealogies, suggestive diagrams, official-looking dossiers placed where future researchers might find them and mistake the performance for a trail. That is what makes the Priory of Sion controversy so useful to this story. Not because it reveals the secret history of the Grail, but because it reveals how secret history can be manufactured. The claim, in its most famous form, was seductive. A hidden society had supposedly protected a sacred bloodline across the centuries. Its members, so the story went, moved through European history like figures glimpsed behind a curtain. Nobles, artists, thinkers, guardians of a truth too dangerous for the ordinary world. The Grail was no longer simply a relic. It was blood. It was descent. It was dynasty disguised as theology. You can see why people listened. The story had everything a modern mystery needs: ancient roots, secret guardians, suppressed documents, a sacred family line, hints of church concealment, enough historical names to sound serious, enough missing evidence to feel tantalizing. It did not ask the audience to believe in magic. It asked them to believe that powerful people had lied. That is a much easier invitation. But the Priory story also shows how quickly the appetite for forbidden history can turn careless. The supposed trail depended heavily on documents and claims that did not withstand scrutiny. The more closely investigators looked, the more the grand ancient society appeared to shrink into something modern, constructed, and staged. The aura of medieval secrecy began to look less like a surviving tradition and more like a 20th century invention dressed in borrowed grandeur. And that is the important lesson. False evidence does not need to be perfect. It only needs to arrive in the right mood. A forged genealogy does not have to convince every expert. It only has to give believers something to point at. A planted document does not have to answer every question. It only has to create the feeling that a hidden archive exists, a name attached to an old institution, a line drawn between families, a symbol interpreted in the most dramatic possible way. Each piece may be weak on its own. Together, arranged with confidence, they can produce the illusion of depth. This is where the priory shadow falls across the red Grail. Because once people believe there must be a hidden bloodline, they begin to read history backward. They do not start with evidence and ask what it supports. They start with the desired secret and search for anything that can be made to lean in its direction. A royal marriage becomes a clue. A lost manuscript becomes a threat. A silence becomes deliberate suppression. Egypt becomes useful because it is ancient, sacred, and incomplete. The method is not investigation. It is decoration. Real investigation is often disappointing. It says, "This document is late. This claim appears only in a questionable source. This genealogy breaks here. This symbol had another meaning in its own context. This dramatic connection depends on a mistranslation. This absence cannot be treated as proof." The conspiracy imagination hears those cautions as cowardice. It prefers the thrill of a hidden design. That does not mean every official record is honest. It does not mean institutions never suppress inconvenient material. They do. They have. History is full of censorship, forgery, propaganda, rewritten memory, and archives shaped by power. But that is exactly why evidence matters. If we already know the past can be manipulated, then we must become more careful, not less. A forged document and a genuine suppressed text can both arrive with an air of secrecy. The difference is not atmosphere. The difference is method. Where did it come from? Who handled it? Can its materials be dated? Do its claims match what is known from independent sources? Does the language fit the supposed period? Does it appear suddenly, conveniently, just when a theory needs support? Does it ask us to ignore every contradiction because the secret is too important to question? The priory controversy is a warning that mystery can be staged, and staged mystery is especially dangerous because it flatters the audience. It tells viewers they are not simply learning. They are joining the few who can see through the lie. That feeling is intoxicating. It makes skepticism feel like betrayal. It makes caution feel dull. It turns historians into gatekeepers and forgers into prophets. In that atmosphere, the Red Grail becomes less a question and more a loyalty test. Do you believe the official version, or do you dare to follow the forbidden trail? But history is not divided so neatly. There is no virtue in believing official claims blindly, and no wisdom in believing every rebel document because it sounds suppressed. The honest path is harder. It asks us to hold curiosity and discipline at the same time. It allows mystery without surrendering judgment. That balance matters because the longing behind the priory myth is not meaningless. People are drawn to secret bloodlines because they sense that power often hides its origins. They know that inheritance can be disguised as merit. They know that sacred language can protect political interests. They know that records can be curated. In that sense, the myth begins with a real suspicion about history. Then it goes too far. It turns suspicion into certainty before the evidence earns it. The Priory Shadow teaches us that a story can borrow the seriousness of archives without becoming true. It can dress itself in names, seals, lineages, and historical scenery. It can use the texture of scholarship while avoiding the burden of proof. It can transform planted evidence into sacred breadcrumbs, then accuse anyone who questions the crumbs of serving the cover-up. And this is why the Red Grail must be handled carefully. If it remains a symbol, it can reveal something profound about how cultures imagine blood, holiness, kingship, and hidden authority. If it is forced into literal history without evidence, it becomes another beautiful trap. Egypt deserves better than to be used as scenery for a forged certainty. Its actual past is already layered enough. Pharaohs who claimed divine order, Greek rulers who learned to speak in Egyptian forms, queens turned into living symbols of legitimacy, Christian monks who made the desert a place of spiritual contest, manuscripts buried and recovered after centuries of sleep. None of this needs a fabricated secret society to become fascinating. The deeper mystery is not whether a hidden brotherhood protected one perfect bloodline. The deeper mystery is why so many people are willing to believe weak paper when it promises forbidden meaning. A forged document can be exposed. A planted claim can collapse. A secret society can turn out to be smaller, newer, and more ordinary than advertised. But the hunger that made people believe it remains. And that hunger will carry the red thread even through evidence that has already begun to tear. Chapter 12. The Red Thread Through False Evidence. Once a story has learned how to survive weak evidence, it becomes very difficult to kill. Not because the evidence grows stronger, because the story learns to feed on weakness. A missing record becomes suspicious. A broken genealogy becomes proof that someone interfered. A symbol with several possible meanings becomes obviously the one meaning the theory requires. A translation becomes less a careful act of language and more a lever, prying open whatever conclusion the storyteller wanted from the beginning. This is how false evidence becomes powerful myth. It does not usually arrive as one enormous lie. That would be too easy to challenge. It arrives in fragments. A suggestive phrase, an old-looking document, a family name placed beside another family name, a carved image lifted out of context, a rumor repeated so often that repetition begins to feel like ancestry. The Red Grail, as a modern idea, lives inside that machinery. It depends less on one discovered object than on a chain of impressions. Blood feels sacred. Egypt feels ancient. Alexandria feels lost. The Grail feels hidden. Early Christianity feels contested. Royal genealogy feels meaningful. Put them close together, and the mind begins to stitch. The stitches may not be historical, but they are emotionally neat, and emotional neatness can be more persuasive than evidence. Consider an ambiguous symbol. A vessel appears in an ancient scene, or a red color is used in a ritual context, or a queen is shown in association with divine imagery. In its own time, that symbol belonged to a specific world of meanings: temple practice, royal display, funerary belief, local theology, artistic convention. But modern legend is impatient with context. It wants symbols to be portable. It wants a vessel to become the vessel. It wants red to become blood, blood to become lineage, lineage to become a secret. The movement is smooth enough that the error can be hard to notice. What began as interpretation becomes identification. That shift is small, but it changes everything. Interpretation says, This image may help us understand a pattern of sacred meaning. Identification says, this image is evidence of the hidden truth. The first leaves room for uncertainty. The second closes the door and calls the click a revelation. Mistranslation works in a similar way. Words are delicate. Ancient languages carry meanings that do not always survive cleanly in modern speech. A term associated with vessel, cup, blood, family, spirit, knowledge, or royalty can become explosive when pulled into a theory already hungry for confirmation. Even an accurate translation can be misused if the surrounding context is ignored. A word may be technically correct and still misleading in the story being built around it. This is why responsible history often sounds slower than legend. Legend leaps. History checks the ground. And the ground beneath bloodline theories is often less solid than it appears. Genealogy is especially vulnerable. It gives myth a skeleton. Names can be arranged in lines. Marriages can be connected across generations. Noble houses can be made to appear as guardians of something older than politics. The page looks orderly, and order feels like truth. But family history is full of gaps, reinventions, flattering claims, and convenient ancestors. The farther back the line reaches, the more fragile it becomes. A single uncertain link can carry an entire theory on its back. And when that link breaks, the believer may simply declare that the break was created on purpose. This is the self-protecting nature of conspiracy thinking. Evidence supports the theory. Missing evidence supports the theory. Contradictory evidence supports the theory because it proves someone wanted to hide the theory. At that point, the idea has stepped outside normal argument. It no longer risks failure. A theory that cannot fail is not strong. It is sealed. The Red Grail rumor gains force from this sealed quality. Every gap in history becomes a chamber. Every silence becomes a locked mouth. Every destroyed archive becomes a deliberate wound. The story flatters us by suggesting that we are close to seeing what others missed or feared. It turns uncertainty into intimacy. We are not merely learning about the past. We are being invited behind the curtain. But there may be no curtain. There may only be distance. Distance between medieval romance and ancient Egypt. Distance between Christian symbolism and dynastic politics. Distance between a sacred vessel in one tradition and ritual containers in another. Distance between real buried manuscripts and the imaginary document that would explain everything too perfectly. That distance is not empty. It is where careful thought happens. The strongest myths often grow from real materials. This is why dismissing them too quickly can be a mistake. Egypt really did have divine kingship. Alexandria really was a place of scholarship, translation, and lost records. Early Christianity in Egypt really was diverse and contested. Manuscripts really did survive in the desert. Medieval Grail legends really did transform over time. Secret societies and forged documents really have existed. The myth does not invent all of its ingredients. It invents the recipe. That is the red thread through false evidence. Not pure fabrication, but arrangement. A little history, a little symbolism, a little silence, a little suspicion, and a great deal of desire. The result feels coherent because the storyteller has removed everything that does not fit. Contradictions are treated as distractions. Context becomes a nuisance. Caution becomes lack of imagination. But imagination is not the enemy. Imagination is necessary to understand the past. Without it, ancient lives become lists of dates and objects. We need imagination to picture a priest entering a temple at dawn, a monk copying a difficult text, a queen appearing before a crowd, a scholar in Alexandria comparing versions of a story. The problem begins when imagination refuses to return to evidence. A good historical imagination kneels down to the fragment. A bad one makes the fragment kneel to the theory. That difference may sound severe, but it is the difference between discovery and manipulation. The emotional force of what if should not be underestimated. What if opens doors. It makes viewers lean closer. It allows forgotten possibilities to breathe again. Many real breakthroughs began because someone asked a question others had dismissed. But what if is a beginning, not a conclusion. It must eventually meet, what do we actually have? What we actually have, in the case of the Red Grail, is not a hidden chalice authenticated by archaeology, not an unbroken sacred bloodline documented across civilizations, not an ancient Egyptian text naming the medieval Grail before medieval Europe imagined it. What we have is a convergence of powerful themes: sacred blood, royal legitimacy, vessels of preservation, death and restoration, hidden writings, lost cities, and modern mistrust of official stories. That convergence is real. The literal claim is not. And perhaps that is why the rumor survives even after its foundations collapse. It speaks to something older than evidence. It speaks to the fear that history has been flattened. It speaks to the suspicion that the most meaningful truths were removed. It speaks to the desire for a world in which symbols are not scattered, but connected. Not accidental, but designed. The Red Grail offers a secret pattern. History offers broken material. Most people, at least for a moment, prefer the pattern. Yet there is dignity in the broken material. A damaged manuscript is more honest than a perfect forgery. A partial genealogy is more useful than an invented royal line. An ambiguous symbol is more interesting when allowed to remain ambiguous. Real history may not give us the clean thrill of revelation, but it gives us something rarer: resistance. It resists our need to make it flatter us. And Egypt, especially, resists. It has been made into a backdrop for every kind of fantasy: ancient wisdom, occult science, lost bloodlines, alien builders, forbidden archives. But beneath those projections is a civilization that does not need our inventions to be profound. Its ruins are not clues in a puzzle designed for modern obsession. They are the remains of people who lived inside their own systems of fear, hope, power, devotion, and survival. The red thread is there, but not where the myth says it is. It runs through our method of storytelling, through the way weak evidence becomes strong when it satisfies a longing, through the way missing records become louder than surviving ones, through the way a symbol can be stretched until it appears to point everywhere at once, and a symbol that points everywhere may, in the end, point most clearly back at us. Chapter 13. Egypt, beneath the water, Egypt, beneath the story. Alexandria did not only lose things to fire, conquest, and neglect. It also lost them to the sea. Along the coast, where the Mediterranean keeps pressing its long blue weight against the city, parts of ancient Alexandria slipped below the surface. Earthquakes, subsidence, rising water, and time altered the shoreline. What had once belonged to streets, harbors, palaces, temples, and royal display became part of a drowned landscape. visible only in fragments when divers, archaeologists, and survey teams began to read the seabed like a damaged manuscript. This is the kind of mystery Egypt actually gives us. Not a perfect chalice lifted from a secret vault. A block of stone under marine growth. A statue broken by collapse. A column lying where no column should be, unless the city itself has moved. A sphinx. A fragment of inscription. A piece of harbor architecture. An object pulled from a world that did not vanish in one dramatic moment, but slowly lost its footing against water and ground. There is something almost corrective about underwater archaeology around Alexandria. It asks us to leave the fever of the hidden bloodline and return to material patience. The sea does not reward theories because they are elegant. It rewards mapping, comparison, conservation, and the careful admission that some finds will remain difficult to interpret. A stone does not become evidence because it feels mysterious. It becomes evidence when its context is understood. That is a quieter kind of revelation, but it is more trustworthy. The submerged remains near Alexandria remind us that Egypt really is still revealing secrets. The difference is that real secrets rarely arrive complete. They emerge with salt damage, missing pieces, uncertain dates, and arguments among specialists. They must be measured before they are mythologized. They must be placed in relation to coastlines, ancient texts, excavation histories, and the stubborn physical behavior of earth and water. This is where archaeology feels almost morally different from conspiracy. Conspiracy begins with the desired answer, and then searches for objects that can be made to serve it. Archaeology begins with the object and tries, slowly, to earn the right question. Around Alexandria, the physical past is not subtle about its complexity. The city was built for grandeur, but also for use. It had ports, breakwaters, royal spaces, temples, warehouses, and neighborhoods where ordinary lives moved beside imperial ambition. Underwater finds can point toward ancient infrastructure and display, toward the shape of the royal quarter, toward the presence of older Egyptian imagery repurposed in a Greek-speaking capital. They show a city that was not merely imagined by later writers, but constructed, inhabited, damaged, and partly submerged. That matters because speculation often treats Alexandria as a symbol first and a place second. A symbol can do anything. It can hide a Grail, guard a bloodline, preserve forbidden doctrine, or become the meeting point of every secret tradition anyone wishes to connect. A place is less obedient. It has geology. It has building phases. It has reused materials. It has sewage, trade, repairs, ship traffic, administrative needs, bad weather, and political decisions that leave marks less romantic than legend prefers. Real Alexandria was not designed to solve our mysteries. It was designed to function, impress, govern, and survive. And it did not always survive gracefully. The sea's invasion of ancient remains gives us a powerful image, but it should not be mistaken for a code. A statue beneath the water is haunting because it collapses distance. The divine or royal face that once looked over a court or sanctuary now lies in a liquid darkness, visited by fish and flashlight beams. The change feels almost symbolic without needing invention. Human power claimed permanence. The coastline disagreed. That, by itself, is enough. The temptation is to make every submerged object part of a hidden story. If the royal quarters is partly underwater, then perhaps the missing archive is there. If the harbor held statues and temple fragments, perhaps the forbidden vessel was lowered into the sea. If Alexandria has drowned layers, perhaps the truth drowned with them. It is a seductive movement from physical loss to narrative certainty, but loss does not tell us what was lost. It only tells us where our ignorance begins. That is not an empty statement. It is one of the most important disciplines in studying the past. We must let absence remain absence unless evidence gives it shape. The fact that part of Alexandria is underwater does not confirm a hidden Grail tradition. It confirms that the ancient city's material record is incomplete, damaged, and still capable of surprise. Those surprises are valuable enough without being forced into a bloodline myth. Underwater archaeology has helped restore the physical imagination of Alexandria. It brings the city down from legend and gives it weight again. We can think of stone blocks hauled into place, statues transported and installed, harbors engineered for movement and control, royal power expressed through architecture visible from land and sea. We can imagine not just philosophers and priests, but laborers, sailors, guards, dock workers, artisans, and officials, the people who kept the city alive while kings posed as eternity. This is the Egypt beneath the story, not less mysterious, more real. It is easy to forget that every grand legend rests on ordinary material survival. Without stone, papyrus, ink, clay, bone, metal, and wood, the past becomes almost entirely rumor. Archaeology pulls against that drift. It forces the imagination to touch something resistant. A coin cannot prove a secret dynasty simply because we wish it to. An inscription cannot be made to say what its words do not say. A harbor installation is not a prophecy. A broken statue is not a confession. Yet these objects can still change the narrative. They can show us where a temple stood, how royal imagery traveled, how Egyptian and Greek forms appeared together, how the city presented itself to those arriving by sea. They can reveal the texture of power, not hidden bloodlines, but public display, not forbidden relics, but monumental persuasion, not one final secret, but the layered work of a kingdom making itself visible. That contrast is important. The Red Grail myth asks Egypt to give us a hidden answer. Alexandria's drowned remains give us hidden evidence. Those are not the same thing. An answer closes the story. Evidence opens it responsibly. It may confirm one claim, weaken another, complicate a third. It may show that a shoreline was different, that a monument was reused, that a royal cult had a stronger presence than expected, or that later memory placed too much confidence in a vanished building. Evidence does not always satisfy the hunger that brought us to the edge of the water. Sometimes it sends us home with better questions and no revelation. There is dignity in that restraint. Beneath the Mediterranean, Egypt is still not finished speaking. But it speaks in fragments, and fragments require humility. The diver does not descend into a legend. The diver descends into pressure, low visibility, currents, measurements, permissions, conservation problems, and the stubborn patience of material history. That patience is the antidote to the false red thread. Because real secrets do not become true by glowing in the mind. They become knowable by surviving contact with the world. Alexandria beneath the water teaches that Egypt can still astonish us without becoming whatever we desire. Its submerged stones do not need to guard the Red Grail. They guard something better. The reminder that history is not silent because it has one perfect secret, but because so much of it has been broken, buried, drowned, and only partly recovered. And sometimes, the fragment is more honest than the legend built to replace it. Chapter 14. What was actually buried? By now, the shape of the mystery has changed. It began with the image of a red vessel beneath Egyptian sand, something hidden, dangerous, perhaps royal, perhaps sacred, a grail before the Grail, a secret older than the stories that named it. But the deeper we follow the trail, the less it behaves like an object. It refuses to sit still. When we look for it in ancient Egypt, we do not find a documented Holy Grail. We find divine kingship, royal bodies treated as sacred instruments, rituals of succession, and myths of death restored into order. When we look for it in medieval Europe, we find the Grail in romance, a mysterious vessel gradually transformed through Christian imagination into a relic of blood, sacrifice, purity, and salvation. When we look for it in early Christian Egypt, we find manuscripts, disputes, monastic experiments, and theological diversity, but not the clear record of a secret royal bloodline. When we look into modern conspiracy, we find a hunger so strong that forged or fragile evidence can begin to glow. So what was actually buried? Not a single answer. A convergence. That word may feel less exciting than chalice, bloodline, or forbidden relic. But it is more honest, and in some ways more revealing. The Red Grail is best understood not as an artifact waiting under the sand, but as the place where several powerful traditions collide: Egyptian sacred kingship, Christian memory, medieval Grail romance, and modern conspiracy culture. Each layer contributes something. Egypt contributes the sacred body of the ruler. The pharaoh was not merely a political figure. He was presented as a mediator between gods and humanity, a living link in the maintenance of cosmic order. His blood mattered because succession mattered, and succession mattered because the throne was wrapped in divine meaning. Egypt knew how to make rulership feel more than human. Christianity contributes the sacred blood of sacrifice. In Christian imagination, blood is not just inheritance. It is redemption, suffering, covenant, and salvation. The cup associated with the Last Supper and the blood of Christ became one of the most potent symbols in later devotion. Here, blood moves away from royal succession and towards spiritual transformation. Medieval romance contributes the quest. It gives the vessel narrative motion. The Grail is not simply present. It must be sought. It tests the seeker. It appears and withdraws. It demands understanding. It turns holiness into a journey through uncertainty. Without romance, the Grail might remain a relic. With romance, it becomes a mystery one can spend a life pursuing. Modern conspiracy culture contributes the hidden design. It takes the sacred vessel and asks whether it was never a vessel at all. It turns blood into genealogy, genealogy into suppression, suppression into proof of importance. It gives the story enemies, guardians, documents, codes, and the thrill of seeing what others supposedly cannot. The Red Grail is born when these four currents are made to flow as one. But they did not begin as one. That is the essential distinction. A symbolic convergence can be meaningful without being literal history. In fact, it may be meaningful because it is not literal. A single artifact would narrow the story. A convergence reveals the mind that created the rumor. Not one ancient mind, but many minds across centuries, each adding a new layer of need. Egypt's role in this convergence is especially important because Egypt gives the story weight. It gives antiquity, It gives temples, tombs, divine kings, lost languages, desert manuscripts, and the feeling that something older than Scripture might be lying beneath Scripture. That feeling is powerful. It can make a modern theory seem ancient simply by placing it against Egyptian stone. But stone does not endorse every story told beside it. The pharaohs did not need the Grail to make blood sacred. They already had their own system. Isis and Osiris did not need medieval romance to make restoration meaningful. Their myth already spoke to death, kingship, mourning, and renewal. The Coptic desert did not need a bloodline conspiracy to be historically important. Its manuscripts and monastic traditions already complicate the story of early Christianity. The real Egypt keeps refusing to become a prop. This is what was buried. Not the Red Grail as a hidden object, but the materials from which later imagination could build it. Buried kings, buried texts, buried cities, buried arguments, buried symbols whose original meanings were not always simple, and whose later reinterpretations became even less so. And perhaps most importantly, buried gaps. The gaps are where the legend breathes, a lost library, a damaged manuscript, a broken genealogy, a queen whose political importance outlived the clarity of her record, a submerged palace quarter, a missing original text known only through later versions. Each absence invites speculation. Some speculation is careful, some is reckless. The Red Grail belongs to the point where speculation begins dressing itself as recovery. It says, the missing piece must be sacred. It says, the silence must be deliberate. And it says, the pattern must be hidden because it is too important to appear openly. But history is rarely so theatrical. Much of what is missing because humans are mortal and materials decay. Because libraries burn, not always in one dramatic blaze, but through neglect, conflict, reuse, damp, and time. Because dynasties collapse. Because languages change. Because scribes copy one text and not another. Because a jar survives and a shelf does not. Because the world is careless with its own memory. That carelessness may be less satisfying than conspiracy, but it is often closer to the truth. Still, the Red Grail should not be dismissed as nothing. A false artifact can contain a real psychological history. The rumor tells us how modern people try to repair the brokenness of the past. We want the fragments to align. We want Egypt, Christianity, kingship, resurrection, and medieval legend to be parts of one hidden machine. We want history to have an underground architecture, and maybe that is the quietest danger of the Grail myth. It makes complexity feel like concealment. When traditions overlap, it assumes code. When symbols resemble one another, it assumes inheritance. When evidence is incomplete, it assumes suppression. Yet the past is allowed to be complex without being secretly arranged for us. Cultures can echo one another without sharing a single origin. Similar symbols can emerge from similar human fears. Blood can mean many things. A vessel can be sacred in more than one world. What was buried, then, was not a chalice waiting to solve the story. It was the human habit of making sacred containers for uncertainty. Egypt made tombs, shrines, coffins, jars, and temples to hold the fragile boundary between life and death. Christianity made sacramental memory around blood, sacrifice, and salvation. Medieval romance made the vessel into a test of the soul. Modern conspiracy made the same vessel into a container for mistrust. The Red Grail is the vessel we imagine when these inheritances are poured together. Its color comes from blood, but not one blood. Royal blood, sacrificial blood, inherited blood, imagined blood. Blood as biology, theology, politics, metaphor, and myth. No single tradition owns it completely, which is why the rumor can travel so easily. It adapts to the desire of whoever holds it. That is the resolution the evidence allows. Not that Egypt hid the Grail. Not that the Grail was secretly Egyptian. Not that a royal bloodline slept beneath the desert, guarded by vanished priests and forged documents, but that Egypt became one of the most powerful places to imagine such a thing, because its real history already touched the deepest themes the Grail would later gather: sacred authority, death, restoration, hidden writing, divine legitimacy, and the terror that memory might not survive. So the Red Grail remains, not in a tomb, not beneath the sea, not in a sealed manuscript waiting to overturn the world. It remains in the space where fact ends and longing begins, arranging the fragments into a shape it can bear to look at. Chapter 15. The Grail we invent when history is silent. In the end, the Red Grail is not found by digging deeper. It is found by listening more carefully to what the silence has made people imagine. Egypt has always invited this kind of longing. Its monuments seem too large for ordinary memory. Its dead were prepared with such care that even decay feels like an interruption, not an ending. Its kings claimed divine nearness. Its deserts preserved manuscripts no one expected to see again. Its cities sank, burned, shifted, and reappeared in fragments. A place like that does not simply hold history. It provokes desire. People come to Egypt looking for origins, the first wisdom, the first kingdom, the first sacred science, the first hidden key. And when the evidence refuses to give one final answer, the mind begins to build what the record will not. A missing text becomes a suppressed gospel. A sacred king becomes a secret bloodline. A vessel becomes a body. A rumor becomes inheritance. This is not only foolishness, it is human. We want history to have a hidden design, because ordinary history often feels unbearable in its disorder. Empires rise for mixed reasons. Religions develop through argument. Texts survive by accident. Power dresses itself in holiness. Women vanish from records that depended on them. Archives collapse. Objects lose their names. The past does not always explain itself with kindness. So we invent grails, not always physical ones. Sometimes we invent a secret document that will make everything clear. Sometimes a lineage that will prove legitimacy. Sometimes a forbidden truth that will rescue the sacred from institutions, or rescue ourselves from the feeling that the world is accidental. The Red Grail belongs to that family of inventions. Its power is not that it has been proven. Its power is that it gathers wounds the historical record cannot easily heal. The wound of lost knowledge, the wound of broken succession, the wound of spiritual uncertainty, the wound of not knowing whether the official story is complete. But if this journey has shown anything, it is that uncertainty deserves better than fantasy. Egypt's real mysteries are not smaller because they resist conspiracy. They are larger. The pharaoh as divine mediator, the Ptolemies translating power across cultures, Alexandria turning knowledge into royal ambition, Isis gathering Osiris against the terror of fragmentation. Coptic scribes preserving difficult sacred worlds, monks making the desert into a theater of the soul, archaeologists lifting broken stone from the sea. None of these requires a hidden chalice to matter. The honest answer is not as clean as legend wants. The Red Grail is less likely a buried object than a symbolic convergence. Egyptian sacred kingship, Christian blood memory, medieval romance, and modern suspicion poured into one vessel. It is what appears when history leaves gaps and longing fills them with red. That does not mean the search was useless. A false mystery can still reveal a true hunger. It can show us what people fear losing, what they hope is still hidden, what kind of proof they need before they can trust the past. The Grail we invent when history is silent tells us less about ancient Egypt than about ourselves. We want the sand to open. We want the sea to return what it took. We want the final manuscript, the final tomb, the final name. But Egypt has never offered its truths that way. It gives fragments. It gives contradictions. It gives enough to keep us humble and enough absence to keep us awake. So perhaps the final lesson is not that the Red Grail waits somewhere beneath the desert. Perhaps it is that the desert teaches us how easily longing can disguise itself as discovery. The sands are not hiding one final answer. They are holding fact and desire side by side, grain by grain, until we learn the difference. And in that difference, the real mystery begins to breathe.